I'm the director of the Mansueto Institute. This is part of our lunch colloquia series, and soon we hope there'll be real lunch. But as it is, we can join from many different parts of Chicago and the country. And today it's my pleasure to introduce Jared Schachner, who's one of our postdoctoral fellows. And as you can see, he's joining from beautiful home in LA with a little bit more sunshine maybe that we have, even though it's not so bad in Chicago today. So we're so happy to have Jared with us. He comes from a PhD at Harvard, firmly grounded in sociology, but interestingly enough also with many other touch points with interesting disciplines from policy and housing, to issues also of human experience, I would say, that touch, skills and cognitive issues and how people actually interact with each other at the neighborhood scale. So his talk today and much of his work is going to be about this idea of, I think, neighborhood effects. In my view, it's been something Jared and I and others here have discussed for a while. Has been described in some sense quite structurally in terms of what the neighborhood is. And I think what's really special about Jared's work is that he's taking that strong idea that's so important for human development, but he's taking it from a perspective also of how people experience that environment, bringing together variables that speak more to those effects. And that might allow us to actually have a sense of how to improve things from the perspective of individuals. As you know, this is very important. This is how urban planners and policy people are talking about in terms of people-centered policies and so forth. We've not quite had that. So Jared's work is very important in that direction. So without much further ado, Jared, it's a pleasure to have you with us, and take it away, please.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Luis, for that introduction. Thank you, Diana, for helping set this up. And thank you to everyone else for attending today. Some of you may remember that a year ago, right before the pandemic hit, I started off talking about neighborhood dynamics in LA. From being in person in Chicago. Today, I'm doing the reverse. I'm going to start talking about Chicago from LA. And so the title of this talk is Neighborhood Effects in the 21st Century, Disadvantage Density and the Spatial Distribution of Institutional Resources. And as I just mentioned, I'm going to take us back all the way to 1970s and 1980s Chicago, specifically the south side of Chicago as the point of departure for this talk. So many of you in this room will know that there was a major kind of shift in the sociology literature and the urban literature around this time. William J. Wilson's The Truly Disadvantaged really embodies this kind of analytical lens that was focused on making sense of social transformations that were being manifested in disadvantaged neighborhoods in Chicago and elsewhere, places like the south side of Chicago, where there were once vibrant neighborhoods that seemed increasingly under siege by poverty, by racial isolation, by crime, by environmental toxins. And scholars like Bill Wilson at the University of Chicago, Doug Massey, and others were trying to make sense of what was going on here. Specifically, one question kind of animated this agenda in the 1980s and 1990s. And it was, what are the causes and consequences of neighborhood inequality, right? So what were the set of processes that were leading us to see these hyper-concentrated ghettos that were extremely concerning from both a policy perspective and a theoretical perspective? And in the 20 to 30 years since, we've made a lot of traction in understanding what were the macro level processes that led to these conditions. So we know that economic dislocations marked by deindustrialization and restructuring had a major impact on the job prospects of disadvantaged minority households. So this is one key factor that led to these spatial concentrations of disadvantage. Another are a set of migratory flows that are both, related to the economic dislocations, but also induced additional effects on these neighborhoods. The Great Migration of Blacks from south to north for economic opportunity is well documented. And we also know that there was white flight to the suburbs that was facilitated by changes in the spatial structure of cities. So as the highways were constructed, single family homes were constructed, whites were moving out of the core city, blacks were moving in from elsewhere, and you saw these racial dynamics continue to create bastions of poverty. Institutional racism is a key factor that cannot be ignored. We know that the federal government through the FHA was subsidizing home ownership, but Blacks were largely excluded and penalized. Meanwhile, urban renewal programs and the concentration of poverty occurred via public housing concentration and redlining practices. So in sum, these set of factors independently and interactively contributed to severe neighborhood segregation by race and class that continues to this day. Now, where the literature shift after kind of establishing these macro level dynamics is trying to understand at the micro level, what were the experiences endured by people that lived within these neighborhoods? How did it matter for American inequality? So as we go from the macro to the micro, it's very clear in the research that race and nativity, as well as household income, are key drivers of who ends up in highly disadvantaged neighborhoods marked by high concentrations of low-income minorities. So those were key drivers of who ends up in those neighborhoods and who gets to avoid them. And one of the kind of richest lines of inquiry that happened since is understanding what the actual effects are of living in a highly disadvantaged neighborhood, especially on children's skills and status. This link has probably been, central for 20 to 30 years, with huge debates among economists and sociologists about whether this is a causal relationship or whether it's confounded by selection processes. Now, I think we've done a good job in sociology and also with some support from economists like Raj Chetty in establishing this as a causal relationship. Neighborhood disadvantage does appear to independently affect children's outcomes, and those children's outcomes turn out to reproduce racial segregation because low-income minorities are disproportionately likely to have these experiences and grow up in and end up in disadvantaged neighborhoods. So this piece, I think, of the conceptual diagram is pretty well solidified. This has led to a pivot in the literature to focus less on whether neighborhood disadvantage matters for kids and more about why they matter. We've tried to open what Rob Sampson calls the black box of mechanisms. Why is it that neighborhood disadvantage seems to impose these long-term negative effects on kids' life outcomes? We've made some progress, not complete progress, in understanding what those types of mechanisms are. Social capital, physical safety, environmental quality, and institutional resources loom large here. But I'm going to make a pivot in this presentation. What I'm going to say is that I'm concerned that we're becoming too path dependent on focusing only on the effects of neighborhood disadvantage and how they're mediated for kids. I think the black box of mechanisms is actually larger. I think there are factors beyond neighborhood disadvantage that independently and interactively affect kids' life outcomes. And I'm concerned we've become so path dependent that we're not looking at what those other neighborhood sets of factors might be that matter for kids and that matter for inequality. So that's the key proposition of the talk. Before I proceed, I want to make sure that everyone feels comfortable interjecting with questions as they come up. So if anyone has any questions right now, feel free to kind of just verbally raise them. And if there's none right now, I'll continue to proceed, but always feel comfortable chiming in. Any questions so far? Okay, I will continue then. So why might we think that neighborhood disadvantage captures some but not all of why neighborhoods matter for kids' development and inequality writ large? We know from Raj Chetty and others' work that neighborhood race and class composition, which is often proxied by the poverty rate or some kind of index, does not fully explain neighborhood differences in child's upward mobility rates. There seems to be a connection, a correlation, but it doesn't seem to provide all the explanation for why some neighborhoods induce positive outcomes for kids and others induce negatives. So a key question is, what explains the rest of the neighborhood effects? I think theoretically, we can also think that there are other neighborhood correlates that might underlie the mechanism thought to affect kids and inequalities. So when we talk about social capital, environmental quality, physical safety, institutional resources, it's not so clear that neighborhood race and class composition is the only factor that shapes those mechanisms. Other pieces or other elements of the neighborhood might determine why some places have access to more safety, higher environmental quality, and others worse. It might not just be a notion or a function of neighborhood race and class, though it's certainly in part a function of that. And I want us to go back in time to think a little bit more beyond, in order to break out of this path dependency. What were other theorists thinking about when they thought about the neighborhood before Bill Wilson and Massey and Denton? My argument is that social ecologists, often many of whom were at the University of Chicago, actually espoused a broader view of how neighborhoods matter for inequality. So let's go back to the Chicago school, back to Lewis Worth. And if you look at his writings, he definitely sees neighborhood disadvantage, specifically race and class composition, as being a key factor that negatively affects individuals' life outcomes. In his view, what he calls heterogeneity or neighborhood race and class diversity creates a variation in norms and values that can weaken social control. Social control is crucial because it enables people within a neighborhood to kind of ensure nobody is violating sets of norms, public safety, or just general. It kind of helps boost trust within a neighborhood, and people think that's an important part of the neighborhood experience. He also mentions population size. So as neighborhoods and cities become larger in terms of population, they foster competition, anonymity, fragmentation, and this can compromise social interaction. But the key feature he mentions, which is going to be the focus of my talk here, is population density. So in his view, he takes a very grim view of population density within the neighborhood and also at the metro level. He claims that density leads to overstimulation. It leads to urban malaise marked by isolation and loneliness. And we see clusters of crime, welfare, and single motherhood clustering in space in ways that suggest population density is bad for human development. Now, at the time of his writings, this is really the modern, he's trying to describe the modern city, right? This is the shift from the countryside to the city, very precipitous urbanization. And so that's in partially these views are a reflection of his time. So if we fast forward, how do we now make sense of density? Does density seem to matter for human development? And what are the theories we can look at to help make sense of that possibility? So if we zoom all the way to the 2000s, we see a double-edged sword of density. So there's a very rich urban economics literature that suggests at the metro level, population density is associated with a lot of positive and a few negative outcomes. As Luis and others' work has shown, metros that are more densely populated tend to see higher levels and growth in worker skills and pay, not only for the most skilled people, but also for less skilled people. So there's these skill complementarities that seem to benefit as metros become more dense. Innovation and GDP per capita are also major benefits of this agglomeration economy's thesis. We see cultural amenities kind of emerge as extremely important here and perhaps benefit from the dense concentration of high incomes and skills. But we shouldn't deny the fact that it's a double-edged sword. Metro population density also comes with house affordability concerns, transit congestion, and this is part of the reason why Richard Florida refers to the superstar city paradigm as the new urban crisis, right? So we basically see huge inequalities, lots of benefits to the top, some negatives to the bottom. But one concern I have with this emerging thesis is that it has a distal link to children's skills and status, right? So yes, all of these factors may be true. However, it's not clear how at the metro level population density affects kids, their development, their trajectories. And that's really one of the core ideas or theses behind the urban sociology paradigm and the idea that these things matter for long-term inequality. So if we shift to more of a children-oriented lens, how should we think about density? Well, Ed Glazer has a very provocative essay that came out last year about density's discontents. And here he talks about a paradox whereby metro population density may accrue positive benefits, especially to adults. Neighborhood density, which may be more salient to kids, actually fosters negative outcomes. So he and a co-author show that cross-sectional correlation suggests neighborhood density is actually associated with less intergenerational income mobility. He claims that that might be related to lower levels of school quality in dense neighborhoods. Maybe core city districts are less effective in giving kids the skills they need to succeed. He also suggests maybe safety from illegal activity is reduced in highly dense urban neighborhoods. This may be a function of just more opportunities for illegal behavior to ensue. And then lastly, he talks about environmental quality as a key mechanism here. So it's possible that highly dense neighborhoods lead to more exposure to lead toxicity and other potential issues there. And so in sum, Glaser has this, what I think is a very provocative kind of summation of what's going on here. He claims that it is a great paradox that cities appear to be forges of human capital for adults, but places where children seem to learn less productive knowledge. And this is really kind of the key thesis that I'm going to try to tackle here. Is Glaser right, or can an urban sociological lens lead us to rethink this claim? I think one intuition here is that maybe what Glaser is talking about may not apply in all places and over time. There's possibilities that what he talks about may matter in Chicago in the mid-20th century, but as we extend our lens or expand it, we may come to a different conclusion. Here's a few reasons why I think density's demons may have abated from Lewis Worth's times as well as from Ed Glaser's assertions. Pat Sharkey has documented a massive crime decline that's occurred over the past several decades. So since the 90s, we've seen precipitous declines, especially in homicide rates and other types of violent crime. And those declines have been steepest in the densest, most disadvantaged neighborhoods. We've also seen through Rob Sampson's work and others that there's been major environmental remediation programs that have potentially disconnected the link between neighborhood density and lead exposure, for example. Chicago is a great example of this. We've seen massive declines in young children's exposure to lead. And that may mean that density's negative effects mediated through that pathway may have attenuated. We also are starting to see, and this is a very preliminary finding that I think is generating a lot of diverse reactions, is that when we actually look at schools' causal effects and we adjust for confounding, schools in core city dense neighborhoods may generate larger gains to skill development than similar suburban schools. So this idea that suburban schools are just uniformly better than urban schools really is being challenged using more rigorous empirical methods. And I think we have some reasons to think not only have demons declined, but density has some hidden assets that I think we need to be more cognizant of. So at the neighborhood level, institutional resources appears to be a potentially important mechanism that matters for why kids do better in some places and worse in others. Scott Allard has talked about the transformation of the welfare safety net. We used to send cash checks from the government to low-income families, but now we've kind of farmed out a lot of the interactions that the state has with low-income families through these kind of intermediary nonprofit institutions. And they are not spatially distributed evenly across the city. It's possible that those crucial institutions that matter for low-income families, whether it's WIC intermediaries or nonprofit anti-poverty organizations, that they are concentrated in dense parts of the city. We also know that schools have endured a market-based transformation, charter schools are on the rise, and it's possible that dense neighborhoods have access to more choices and potentially more high-quality school choices than less dense neighborhoods. One thing to also keep in mind from Mario Small's work, as well as Pat Sharkey's, is that these kind of neighborhood institutions play crucial roles in building social ties and social order, as well as kind of instigating collective efficacy within the community. So I think institutions really are crucial to how we should think about the contemporary city. And from this point of view, dense neighborhoods may have a leg up versus less dense neighborhoods in terms of access to those institutions. So here's kind of the overview of how I'm proposing we update the urban neighborhood effects paradigm. When we think about the black box of mechanisms that affect neighborhoods, that kind of mediate neighborhood effects on kids, it's not only neighborhood disadvantage, it may also be neighborhood density that affects institutional resources and in turn shapes kids' development. And so if we think about what the core research question I have after going through that long-winded setup is, I want to understand if neighborhood density impedes or propels children's cognitive development, net of the traditionally focused neighborhood disadvantage variable. If neighborhood density does matter, what potential mechanisms may mediate the link? And as I've mentioned, my hypothesis in some ways is counter to the Ed Glazer thesis and others. I think neighborhood density independently propels children's skill access via access to the denser concentrations of institutional resources. And we might see this pathway matter, especially for disadvantaged children, because they are especially reliant on these kind of nonprofit third-party organizations that are increasingly important in the contemporary American social safety net. Okay, so that's really the thrust of my argument. And in what remains, I'm going to talk through how I empirically test this proposition. But before I do, I want to make sure that the front end and kind of the logic behind the argument makes sense. So if anyone has any thoughts or questions, please feel free to chime in. Okay, yeah.
One question is, when you talk about institutional resources, how do you see this as like the work of like specific organizations, the work of the state, the work of different just like community groups that aren't necessarily organizations? Like what are we thinking about when we talk about institutional resources here?
Right. I think that's a crucial question to kind of deconstruct what's a vast category and think more in a more fine-grained terms about what we mean. As I'll talk through shortly, I'm thinking about it in the sense of what the National Charitable Statistics Center for Charitable Statistics provides when we think about nonprofit organizations. So these are 501c3 organizations that have filed tax returns suggesting that they are kind of these specialized groups. They have limited tax liability, and in the urban literature, that's often how we operationalize these kind of neighborhood institutions. But I also want to be clear, this is very early stage research, and I think future stages of the research will think in more fine-grained terms about what specific categories of those nonprofit 501c3s matter more or less than others, and what are some other organizations that matter, such as charter schools, magnet schools, private schools, preschools, right? There's a whole kind of ecosystem of institutional resources that we have to think about. I haven't nailed down how to kind of create that taxonomy here. So for now, I'm going to think about, what the National Center for Charitable Statistics thinks of. And I'll talk through how I operationalize that in more detail shortly, but that's kind of the broad view I'm taking. I don't know if you have any other questions or suggestions based on that.
So Jared, yeah. I'm going to wait and see how you actually do this.
Yep.
There is a lot of writing, including my own, that digs into this question. I didn't see any of that in your setup.
That's right.
So I'm just going to wait and see what you do, and then we can talk about it later.
That'd be great. I really appreciate that, because I'm coming at this as from more of a structural neighborhood effects lens and less from the fine-grained understanding of institutional resources and how they vary across space and time. So I think that's a weakness of kind of where this project is now, and I really would benefit from understanding more about where the literature is on that question. Okay, so if this is the key, I've just laid out the key question, the key hypothesis. I'm going to talk through the empirical strategy, and I'll try to do that swiftly. So the Los Angeles Family and Neighborhood Survey is the backbone of my empirical approach here. I think it's a pretty unique survey in that it's multi-level. It tracks individuals, households, and census tracts, which are operationalizations of the neighborhood. This version captures them at two different waves. So it's a longitudinal panel data set that tracks these families in the early 2000s, as well as once again in the middle to late 2000s. The key outcome of interest, which I'll talk through, is a classic kind of child skill development outcome. It's a measure of the child Woodcock-Johnson assessment, the letter word identification test score, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that score consists of. I have a very rich set of controls and moderator variables that I employ: child race, household income. I have parents' educational status, their cognitive and socio-emotional health. and some other tract level measures of the conditions that kids are in via this LA FANS study. I linked this multi-level data set to a wide array of other data sets. So I bring in tract level data from the Census and American Community Survey. I'm looking at change over time, but I want to focus on kind of baseline characteristics of the neighborhood where children are raised. So I look at in the year 2000, what is the race and class composition of the neighborhood in which the child is raised? That's the classic kind of neighborhood disadvantage paradigm. That's what almost all neighborhood effect studies look at in urban sociology. I add in the simple population density measure, right? So this is the number of people, all people that reside within a census tract in the year 2000, adjusted for the land area, right, to get the population density here. I think this is the crucial piece for many people in the room. In order to operationalize institutional resources and specifically nonprofits, I look at the total number of nonprofits within one of 8 county regions that the child is raised in. I can talk more about county regions at some point if we need more clarification, but the idea here is that if you just look at within the census tract, that's not a good universe by which to measure whether there is accessible institutions. Some people live in census tracts with 0 institutions, some live in census tracts with many. So you kind of need a geographic unit that captures the accessibility. And I think county region is larger and captures more the accessibility of those nonprofit institutions that matter. As Nicole mentioned and others mentioned, nonprofit density is a very kind of coarse measure of what's going on. So I basically just look at the number of nonprofits within the county region, adjusted for the number of people who live within that county region, right? So it is adjusted by population, but it's a very coarse measure. And we can talk now, or maybe right after I present the empirical results, about what a better strategy would be for capturing the institutional resource piece. In robustness checks, I want to counter some of the neighborhood effects literature that suggests that there's other mechanisms that matter for kids. Environmental toxins is one, so I bring in some EPA tract level data to see if that's potentially confounding any effects that I find from other neighborhood measures. And I also bring LA Times measures of crime. These are annual homicide numbers averaged over time, to see whether maybe what I'm capturing is actually something else, whether it's crime or environmental toxicity. I built a multi-level model that combines all of these data sets into kind of a skill development model. So the key here is that I'm looking at a lagged dependent variable model. I'm trying to predict the Woodcock-Johnson letter word score for all children I have available within the panel data set at wave 2 of data collection. So this is in the mid to late 2000s. And this module think about it as kind of a reading assessment. It's asking kids to identify letters and words and passages of reading. And it's very often used as, one of these course skill measures tracking language development among kids. It's correlated with future life outcomes like income and education. And I think the benefit here is not only do I have this outcome in wave 2, but I also have the lag dependent variable, which is the baseline measure at wave 1, which helps address concerns about causal inference and causal identification, right? This is really like a first difference model. It's not just looking at some kind of cross-sectional set of relationships. The key predictors here, as mentioned on the front end, are disadvantage and advantage indices measured at the neighborhood level. The clear expectation is that these features should do most of the explanatory work when we think about what neighborhood factors matter for kids' skill development. I add in the rarely employed neighborhood population density measure, rarely employed in this particular literature as a key driver of children's skill development. And I mentioned how I measure that. A key mediator I look at is the simple nonprofit organization number per capita within the county region of residence. And then I bring in a whole range of controls. I mentioned that I have baseline measures of children's Woodcock-Johnson letter word score at wave 1, which helps me strip out some of the concerns about causal identification and endogeneity. I have child race, household income, and a range of potential parental confounders that may affect the results. As I mentioned as well, I also have robustness check controls that address other kind of mechanisms by which neighborhoods may matter for kids. So the multi-level model is just a 3-level hierarchical linear model. Think of this basically as an OLS, but that adjusts the standard errors for the nesting of this unique data structure, because I have child observations nested within households, which are nested within neighborhoods. And so in order to make sure you're getting that valid standard errors, you want to create some structure on the model. And this 3-level hierarchical linear model enables me to do this. So I'd like to get through the key empirics within the next 10 minutes in order to ensure we have at least 15 minutes to talk through questions and answers, et cetera. This is kind of the key traditional neighborhood effects result. So the idea here is that if we just have basic controls like race and class of the household within which a child is raised, and then we bring in the simple neighborhood advantage index, what we see is a 1 standard deviation increase in neighborhood advantage at baseline predicts about a 3.5 percentile gain on the Woodcock-Johnson assessment for kids. This is kind of a moderate sized effect. I think it reinforces what a lot of the literature says, which is that we're getting, a few percentiles in the distribution through having access to a kind of a more advantaged versus less advantaged neighborhood. One thing I want to point out is the neighborhood disadvantage index does not have any significant effect. It seems that neighborhood advantage better captures the structural composition of the neighborhood in terms of this outcome that I'm looking at. Here's the key piece where my theoretical framework comes in. When you bring in just the neighborhood, you take out the neighborhood advantage index and place in the neighborhood density index, you get an effect that's considerably larger. It's about a 5 percentile boost by increasing your neighborhood density exposure by 1 standard deviation. This is a highly significant result. So the next step is to combine the two, right? Neighborhood advantage and neighborhood density are not orthogonal to each other. In fact, they're related. So when we plug both into the model, do we see one of those effects evaporating and the other emerging? And I think interestingly, we see that both matter, right? So this is not an either or argument, this is a both and argument. And I think what's especially interesting about this particular model is you see the total neighborhood effect doubles in size. Before, if we use the naive models, we may have thought neighborhood effects exert maybe 1 standard deviation affects 3.5 points on the Woodcock-Johnson assessment. In this model, we see a trebling of that effect, almost 10, 11 points of benefit from being in a highly advantaged and highly dense neighborhood for the full sample. Now, once we bring in beyond basic controls, a finer grained set of controls, such as parents' cognitive socio-emotional skills and a range of other factors we know matter, this kind of gets at this concern that neighborhood effects are actually just reflecting selection or confounding. What we see is that the neighborhood density effect is very robust to the inclusion of this rich set of controls. The neighborhood advantage piece, less so, right? So we still see a kind of marginally significant effect of neighborhood structural composition, but the neighborhood density effect is larger and more precisely estimated, okay? So we're seeing both factors may matter. Neighborhood density effects may matter more for the whole sample. And as a way to kind of do a falsification check to make sure that we're seeing kind of a treatment dose response, what I want to do is look only at the children who stayed within the same neighborhood over the full kind of wave 1 to wave 2, 6 to 8 year period. If we see these effects being larger within those stairs, we might assume that there is kind of a treatment effect, right? Like more exposure to those variables may matter more. And indeed, that's exactly what we find. We see that children who stayed within the same place seem to accrue the benefits of neighborhood density even more than those who moved, right? So the movers actually, you don't see a significant effect of either of these baseline measures, but the stayers, you see large effects, both significant, of both neighborhood structural composition and neighborhood density. The next step, I think, is to really understand the mechanisms that might explain these correlations or these conditional correlations. You might remember that I thought institutional resources may be key mediators, especially for disadvantaged families, right? because these disadvantaged families rely disproportionately on nonprofit organizations in terms of getting their children access to resources and skill development, my theory was that neighborhood density may matter via institutional resources. And I try to test that by segmenting the sample only to Black and Latino families. The first thing I see is that neighborhood advantage and neighborhood density exert more or less equal effects when I'm just looking at that group and incorporating all available controls. So instead of thinking about density as mattering more, I think this reinforces the notion that neighborhood structural advantage and disadvantage matters a lot for disadvantaged families. However, neighborhood density also matters to a similar degree. Once I bring in this key nonprofit density mediator, it does seem like both neighborhood advantage and neighborhood density effects are largely mediated potentially through this nonprofit density pathway. In fact, the nonprofit density pathway appears to, with a 1 standard deviation increase in that variable, you see a 6 percentile gain in Black and Latino children's skills, which I think is a large effect. And you no longer see any significant effects of neighborhood advantage and density. And so I think this is fairly strong evidence that institutional resources matter a lot for disadvantaged kids, and that part of the neighborhood effect we've observed, whether it's through advantage or density, operates through this channel. As a kind of falsification check, I want to see if this is kind of goes with the spatial mismatch hypothesis. Maybe it's not nonprofit density that matters, but maybe job density, right? So maybe disadvantaged households need to have access to jobs nearby. That helps the parents maybe bring in more income. And maybe density matters for that reason, not because they have access to nonprofits nearby. I don't really see any mediating effect, or it's a very minor mediating effect, when I bring in that job density measure from the Lotus database. The nonprofit density effect seems to matter more, and that isn't congruent with my theoretical framework that I mentioned on the front end. I think it's important not only to understand what matters most for the most disadvantaged kids, but also to think about what matters for advantaged kids, like the white, Asian, and other kids. And I think this is interesting. I think the literature has not focused as much on this group, but we need to understand both ends of the distribution in terms of how neighborhoods reproduce inequality. What I was really surprised by here is that neighborhood density matters even more for this advantaged group. However, it's not institutional resources that seem to be doing the work in terms of the mediating. In fact, I don't have much evidence at all that nonprofit density matters for the richer kids, and I don't even have much evidence that job density matters. So this is a key piece of the analysis that I am not exactly clear on what the mechanism is, but I think it's something to keep an eye on. So just to talk through my robustness checks before I wrap up, you may be thinking in your head, great, you focused on institutional resources as a mediating pathway, but we have this growing literature in urban sociology that suggests crime is what matters for neighborhoods, or environmental toxins are what matter, or social capital is what matters. But what you see across the board in both strata of the sample is that those factors are not really confounding the nonprofit density effect, and they're not exerting independent effects on my outcome on their own. This story that I'm telling is really one about density operating through institutional resources. When we look at the more advantaged group, again, we're seeing the results that I've produced robust to the inclusion of these other potential neighborhood factors that matter. This is really the puzzle here, that among whites and Asians, density matters a lot, but it's not mediated through the traditional pathways that we think about. So let's briefly recap the results, and I'll bring everyone in to discuss shortly. You'll recall that the main question was, does the neighborhood density impede or propel children's cognitive development net of neighborhood disadvantage? My hypothesis was that, counter to Ed Glazer's argument, neighborhood density propels skills via access to nonprofits, and this matters most for disadvantaged children. I think I've found fairly robust report for urban density actually inducing dividends, not discontent. And it's, though the sources of urban density's dividends for the most advantaged children remains unknown, and this analysis cannot solidify that piece of the puzzle. When we think about the theoretical implications, I'm going to be very curious to think about what the rest of you think. My first reaction is that when we think about the neighborhood effects literature, neighborhood disadvantage does not tell the whole story of contextual effects. That's the main punchline here. And I think we need to continue to keep the door open to other factors that matter, such as population density. I think it's possible that there's temporal and geographic variation in the relative effects of disadvantage and density. What I found here may be specific to LA in the 21st century, and we should talk more about what theories might explain that variation. The key is, I think we need to continue to think broadly about what our theories are of neighborhood mechanisms and not shut the door on potential pathways and I'm worried that the current literature might do that. Lastly, to Chris and others in the room who think about agglomeration economies, I think we need to supplement this prevailing metro level account of skill agglomeration dynamics to think about how agglomeration matters at the neighborhood level. I've yet to see a compelling urban economics argument about how neighborhood level density dynamics really matter for kids. We need to expand our focus beyond the adult labor market and think about kids' cognitive and socio-emotional skill development, which in my view forms the foundation of long-term skill development and long-term economic development. So I'm going to stop here on the theoretical implications so that I can open up to questions and discussion. If people want to talk about the policy implications, I have another slide on that I'm happy to move us towards next, but I realize we're running fairly short on time, so why don't I stop there for now?
Thank you, Jared. So we can open up for questions. So think about your question. I was just wondering as I was listening, give us a sense of what you mean by density. Like, what kind of neighborhood are we talking about? Are we talking about the neighborhoods in your fits where we see disadvantaged populations, benefiting more through this institutional linkage versus perhaps less disadvantaged populations benefiting more from density? I mean, LA is dense, but it's not so dense. It's kind of a curious thing.
Right. So I think it's important to keep in mind, this is where we get into the temporal and geographic variation. I'm looking at density within Los Angeles, not across various cities. So when we think, I think what's important to realize is that in Los Angeles, there are both dense low income and dense high income neighborhoods.
Right.
Okay. So these things are not perfectly correlated. We can't think about like highly dense neighborhoods within downtown Los Angeles as being kind of like this tight cluster of poverty and density. There's also dense neighborhoods like Manhattan Beach, which if anyone's been to Manhattan Beach, is highly clustered, highly advantaged sets of residences on the coast of California, right? If you drive up just PCH a couple miles, you'll get to Malibu, which is similarly advantaged, maybe slightly more advantaged, but very low density, right? So we want to think about, and this is where I'm trying to push the neighborhood effects literature, it may matter whether you grow up in Manhattan Beach or Malibu. This is not an immaterial question for someone who's interested in inequality and urbanism and the mechanisms that matter. Similarly, and I think this is crucial for people who take the traditional paradigm, there are highly dense neighborhoods that are probably in people's imaginations, like Skid Row, Los Angeles, right? Or downtown Los Angeles, highly dense low-income neighborhoods. What I think people are not thinking about is the Santa Clarita Valley or the Antelope Valley. These are very dispersed places that are relatively low income. And the developmental consequences of living in those places, even if they are both disadvantaged, are very, very different. And we used to think that moving kids from places like Skid Row out into the suburbs, out into places like the Santa Clarita Valley would benefit them. My argument here is we really need to think more about the theory before we start providing vouchers for people to deconcentrate the center of the city. Yeah. There's way more going on here. And I think that's really the punchline of the talk, that the moving to opportunity experiment and other types of voucher-based programs are kind of putting the cart before the horse. We don't know yet why some neighborhoods are better for kids than others. We have some idea, but I think we need to kind of build out that theory more before we invest billions of dollars in a voucher-based strategy.
Thanks, Jared. Go ahead, Nicole. I see you have a few things in the chat too. Go ahead.
Hi, Jared. So I look forward to talking with you about this more than we're going to be able to here. So let's make sure we do that. I have one just clarification question and then one observation about the nonprofit data. I was unclear. You're looking at nonprofit density at the county level, you said?
Sorry, the county region level. So
the county what?
region level. I should probably explain that more. Would it be helpful for me to break that down a little bit?
Yeah, because what I'm confused about is if you're counting nonprofit density at the county region level, but you're looking at the effects on kids at the neighborhood level, and this is all happening within LA, like, I don't understand how there's any variation in nonprofit density for anyone.
Right. So here's this is a crucial point that I should have spent more time on. Los Angeles County, I think, is distinct from some urban inequalities in the sense that it has basically what Rob and I think are 7 to 8 distinct regions that really structure social life in the city. So if you're a Los Angeles County resident, it's not like you're living on the west side and then you're going to school in Santa Clarita Valley or Antelope Valley or the San Gabriel Valley. Your whole social world is in large part structured by one of those 8 regions that you live in, whether it's the San Fernando Valley, West Side, gateway cities, central downtown LA, etc. These are 8 distinct kind of ecologies, is what we argue in a 2017 Russell Sage Foundation piece. And we empirically justify kind of that structure by showing that 90 to 95% of all residential moves happen within those sectors, not across them. Subsequent research shows in my school analyses that people also almost 95 to 99% of children are attending schools within their region, not across regions. So both in terms of where people are moving, where people are sending their kids, and next I intend to find out where they're commuting to jobs, are structured by this kind of broader ecology. It's larger than a tract, it's larger than a neighborhood, but it's smaller than a municipality and it's smaller than the county as a whole. And so I think it's crucial to think theoretically and empirically about what type of density matters. My argument here is that having an organization in Beverly Hills benefits a resident of someone in Culver City, because that's a 5 to 10 minute drive. I don't only want to look at Culver City organizations because I don't think that properly captures the lived experience in Los Angeles. And so I think in future research, I need to look at robustness checks. Does it matter if the organizations are within 2 miles, 5 miles, et cetera? But, I have some skepticism of these kinds of radius boundaries because I just don't think they properly reflect the social life of the city. So this is kind of the imperfect compromise. But there is a high degree of variation when you look at the Santa Clarita Valley, Antelope Valley versus density of organizations in the core city of Los Angeles.
Okay, Jared, you have lots of questions. So
Okay,
we may want to say how people may be able to contact you beyond the 10 minutes we have.
Perfect. So Nicole, I'll follow up with you on that part. And then Luis, you take it away in terms of where to go next.
Well, I think we're gonna do something risky here, is that I'm gonna invite people that have questions in the box or other questions to jump in. So this selects a little bit for those of you who are braver or cheekier. Yes, but I have questions from Arvin, Nick Mader, Chris Esposito, Nicole Rosner. So you guys, if you can jump in and ask a question, we have still another 10 minutes. So we can at least take 2 or 3.
Thank you.
So thank you for the wonderful presentation. And I think my question was regarding when you talk about urban density and neighborhood density particularly, and how it affects child outcomes. I'm wondering if there was an opportunity to look at this relationship conditioning on the segregation level within the city, and also on any kind of measure on the level of redistribution within the city.
Yes. So I think that's an excellent point. I think this underscores a key limitation of this study because it's a single city study. So what I gain in terms of the very fine-grained data, a lot of texture in what's happening in one place, I sacrifice the ability to look at those kind of metro level or city level moderating factors that may mean density matters more or less in different places at different times. So I don't have the data to really inform your argument. I think we need to think theoretically about how this would look different in other places. I think kind of the key prior for people like Doug Massey, maybe Kyle Crowder, would be that metros that are more highly segregated, you may see the racial composition of the neighborhood having a stronger effect on the number or density of nonprofit organizations accessible to low-income kids. Again, I'm not an expert in this field. Nicole would probably know more about those relationships, but I think it's very likely that there's these metro level moderators that affect the relationship between density and disadvantage at the neighborhood level on kids' daily experiences. And so maybe this is kind of a theoretically strategic case. Los Angeles County may be not representative of the rest of the country, but I think it's at least important to push us to think about the Chicago school, Southside Chicago, Chicago as a whole may not tell us everything we need to know about how neighborhood effects matter in the 21st century. And so, a future paper, I would love to look at what you're suggesting, which is that the inequality of distribution or the segregation at the metro level may amplify or attenuate neighborhood disadvantages effects and neighborhood densities effects. But these are complicated multi-level hypotheses. And as far as I know, no one has really locked down these relationships.
Yeah, it'd be interesting, Arvind, to bring up the things you were telling me yesterday about educational choice and how those are conditioned in different environments. So you guys should talk.
Yeah, if educational choice is at all on your mind, I definitely want to talk to you about that piece.
Any other questions? Please jump in.
So Jared, I really enjoyed this talk, so thank you, and I'm sure we'll have to talk about it more. I was just trying to understand the logic for dividing computing institutions per capita on like a density basis as opposed to having that in as either a raw or like a logged variable.
Exactly.
So just turn that.
Yeah, I've really struggled with this, and it sounds like based on what you and Nicole are saying, as more kind of institutional resource experts than I need to kind of revisit the way to think about access to institutions. I wanted to adjust for the fact that just having, a binary measure, whether an institution is there or not there, misses the fact that neighborhoods are resource constrained. Institutions are resource constrained. One organization serving 100,000 people has fewer resources than one that's, helping 100 people. So maybe this kind of density measure is not the way to capture kind of institutional capacity. Maybe a revenue-based measure would be appropriate here. But I think the upshot from both you and Nicole's point is that I need to go in that literature and understand more about the right way to think about kids' access to institutions. How does institutional resources, how is it best captured? How do you think about not just the existence of institutions, but their capabilities, as well as maybe the sectors within which they're focused? I think Pat Sharkey does some of this disaggregation by sector, and I think that could be a place where this goes to, right? Not all organizations are created equal. Some are more focused on skill development among children, and we would expect to see those factors having a stronger mediating role than nonprofits that focus on workforce development or something else.
Okay, Nick, Nicole, or anyone else? Max?
I think Max was before me, but I can go really quickly. Thanks so much, Jared. I really enjoyed this. And I just had a few clarification questions, I guess. I was wondering if you could explain, you did a little bit when you talked about density, but if you could explain a bit of the background on the relationship between race, class, and residential segregation in LA. Yeah. Especially because you start with Chicago. So, and I'm not very familiar with LA, but I've read about it, and my understanding is it's quite distinct from Chicago.
Yep.
And so, and then kind of I felt like there was kind of an underlying assumption that white, Asian, other neighborhoods, and then Black and Latinx neighborhoods are highly segregated by race and class, and that this might not be the case. And if this isn't the case in LA or in some of the areas that you're looking at, like how does that impact your analysis? And then if you could explain, just because I'm not so familiar with this literature, what you mean by skills, and then
yes.
And then also kind of how you account for skills developed outside formal institutional structures. So maybe, for example, density creates a much richer community-based resource for kids living in these neighborhoods, right? And they develop different types of skills that then go on to, I'm not sure what the meaning of skills is basically for your analysis, but it could go on to impact their life.
Great. Okay, so these questions are great and really push me on some of the thinking. I think it reminds me of the fact that you actually are a key, this is a shout out to Nicole, who's a key motivator for this type of study, because she asked a question that urban sociologists almost never ask, which is why would you think of neighborhood quality in terms of its race and class composition when there are so many other ways to think about the quality of life in a neighborhood? And this paper is one small step to try to get there. How do we have a more holistic or comprehensive idea of neighborhoods experiences? So, okay. To start with, I just want to focus on the skills piece first, and then I'll talk more about the segregation dynamics. In terms of skills, this is obviously an imperfect operationalization of skills using these kind of reading-based measures of skill development from the Woodcock-Johnson assessment. I think they're important because they do suggest kind of the ability to understand, interpret, and communicate information. And they're highly predictive of socioeconomic outcomes later in life. So I think in that sense, these skills give us these kinds of surrogate measures or intermediary measures for how kids will progress throughout their lives. And I think there's robust empirical evidence suggests that in terms of the long-term effects on income and education, the skills you have in young adulthood as well, young childhood as well as early to late childhood, these skills are good proxy measures, even though they're imperfect. I think you're raising an important point, because if I use math skills instead of these kind of vocabulary or reading skills, the story changes a bit. And so I think the literature has to think more about the whole constellation of skills available and how neighborhood effects may differ based on what skills we're thinking about. I think a lot of the literature focuses on vocabulary skills. That's what I focus on here, but maybe we could follow up with thinking about what other kinds of skills matter. I think it makes sense to me that density would matter for the kind of the ability to process and interpret information, whether it's via social interactions or via institutions and nonprofits. I think that relationship makes sense. I think thinking about the relationship between kind of neighborhood, race and class and neighborhood dynamics in LA, I think one thing that is striking to people is that how much this kind of concentration of Black households within neighborhoods has changed since the 1990s. There are almost no kind of primarily Black quote unquote ghettos or concentrated pockets of disadvantage in LA anymore. Almost all of those neighborhoods in South LA, et cetera, have become 50-50 Latino Black, with some gentrifiers coming in. And this is again why LA may be an extreme case, but an important case to understand contemporary segregation. You may have had a stronger argument in the 1990s that those neighborhoods that were primarily Black were completely disinvested, that they were basically completely vulnerable to institutional racism. And now the story is complicated by bringing in the Latino immigration piece, right? And there's a whole constellation of social processes that might come with that change. I realize I'm running out of time, but it feels like Nicole, you and I, both Nicoles, I'm going to need to follow up with to think more about those questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jared. I
really like where you're pushing the work. So Luis, I know I'm pretty much up. I don't know if you want to take one more or if we should just...
If you're willing, I know people can leave.
I'm not in a rush, so if anyone wants to hop off.
So there are just a couple of questions from Nick and Max, if you guys want to jump in, or anybody else who has a question that's not in the box. If you guys feel like you'd like to continue, I think Jared can be here for a little bit longer.
Yeah, mine was more of a comment than a question, which is just one thing that you may want to think about is also like institutional pressures in who the community-based organizations have to serve. I don't know if there's any literature on this across the board, but we know anecdotally that there's a lot of political funding constraints in terms of making sure you're serving the quote unquote right type of youth. And a lot of the time the right type of youth that's a racialized lens. So just a comment on like maybe one of the reasons you may not be seeing that mediator for different groups of youth.
Yes, I like that idea a lot. And again, underscores like what Nicole Marwell and others were saying earlier, really deconstructing what's going on across the vast ecosystem of institutions is crucial to understanding these density dynamics.
And this is Nick Mader, just chiming in to say I had a couple more comments in there, just welcoming further interaction since we're just about at time. But hopefully the chat can be saved and that can be helpful.
Definitely, that'd be great.
That's great, everybody. Thanks for coming. Thanks especially to Jared for a very interesting talk. But as you can see, Jared, there's a lot of work here
Yeah.
of engagement and so forth, which is wonderful.
Yep.
So, to be continued. But I think you all know how to find Jared. But if not, Jared can just mention now in closing. So thank you,
Yes.
everybody, and see you soon. There you go.
Thank you so much, Luis, and everyone else for coming. Really appreciated those great comments, and this is definitely a long ongoing project, so nothing's getting published tomorrow, and I hope to work with you all to make the piece better. Thanks again.
Bye, everybody.